classes, I've been able to record or save the Zoom file like on my laptop or my desktop, and
Uh-huh.
then I can refer back to it later on.
Uh,
That's what
you're
I've been.
you're more than welcome to do that, but there will be a link just to the YouTube lecture part if you would like that as well.
Okay, so for the YouTube one, is that public, like to anybody?
Yes, and that's why I ask that if you don't like to be recorded, at the end of the lecture part, we'll stop the recording and I'll ask if there's any questions. If you're
Okay,
okay being recorded and want to ask a question during lecture, go for it. But this is the only part of the class that will be recorded is this lecture part.
okay,
Okay?
thanks.
Mhm. All right, so let's get through this. Thanks for that question, by the way, and getting clarification on that. Okay. So we first should discuss what is the study of human development and what we now call life. There's different terms for a class like this. It used to be called developmental psychology, and now there's human growth and development, and then there's lifespan, known as lifespan courses, and that's because what really the study of human development and human growth and development are is the study of how people change over time. Usually we look at it chronologically from birth to death, or actually in some courses you'll do from conception to death. And we'll get a little bit of that in this class as well. But it's really about how we change and how we develop. Okay. Now, I'll use the term human development, developmental psychology, human growth and development, lifespan development, and those are all interchangeable terms. They mean the same thing when we talk about them. But some of the issues that you'll see is that a lot of this class seems to focus on people from the age of 0 to 18. And this is largely due to a historical misunderstanding about when we stop to develop. Okay. Some of the original theories that we'll go over in this class, starting with someone like Sigmund Freud's developmental theory and many other developmental psychologists after him, is they set the age of development to the age of 18 because what they proposed is after the age of 18, your personality is set, your intelligence is set. There's nothing much more than that you're going to grow and learn and develop. Okay. This largely has to do with human beings' existence on this earth. Okay. Because before about 120, I should add more years to this. I would say for about, I need to really update this thing. Probably if I add to the time this slide was made, in the past about 140 years, our lifespan has doubled. Okay. For the majority of human existence, the average age of life was around 40. Okay. Now, that's not to say if you look at the historical records, there were people who lived into their 70s and 80s. Uh, but what this is saying is that the average person, the majority of individuals, only lived into their 30s and 40s. And so it was assumed that by the age of 18, you needed to have everything you uh, needed in order to survive in your short adult life. Okay. But over about the last 140 years, due to medical advancements, vaccines, sanitary conditions, all of those things, our life has doubled. Okay. And so over about the last about 50 years, Psychologists and people who study development have realized that we don't stop at 18. That because of this expanded life expectancy that we now can view, there's a lot more to growing up and developing and changing that happens well beyond the age of 18. Okay. And so, and indeed, some individuals have argued that we actually live two lives. We live 0 to 40 in our first life, and then 40 to the end of our life in our second life. The evidence they use for this is a lot of individuals between the age of 35 to 45. This is where we get, for example, the highest divorce rates. This is where we get transition of children leaving the house and even more children being born. This is where we see people go back and rethink their career. And a lot of individuals will actually go back to school during this time. This is also where we're starting to see the most dysfunction and breaking of an individual that as we will get to when we get to middle adulthood. So some have argued that we really need to study development in two segments, the first part of life and the second part of life. What I would encourage you all to know is getting old is doesn't really suck that much. Okay. I know we're in a youth society where we try to keep our youth and we try to keep, young and all of those things. But what I hope you get out of this class is there's a lot of cool things to look forward to. Okay. For example, the age between 45 and 55 is when you'll have your highest decision-making ability, your highest level intelligence, your highest level of being able to solve complex questions, not answers. Your 30s to mid 30s, when everybody goes, oh, there's the 30s. Unless you really beat up your body in your youth with substance abuse and bad habits and everything else, the healthiest time a human being is physically is between the age of 33 and 38. That's something to look forward to because we think we're most physically fit in our teens and 20s, but actually it's the mid 30s when we are actually most physically fit. Something to look forward to. I won't get to old age, but I will say that the people who have the most erotically satisfying life are women in their 60s and men in their mid 50s. Again, something to look forward to. But we will get to that later in the course. So there's a lot to look forward to throughout the lifespan. It's just not all about physical and mental decline. In fact, the mental decline we don't actually see as much. In the majority of individuals who stay healthy and connected to their world. So that's kind of why we're looking at the entire lifespan in modern developmental psychology. And I will tell you who should really be studying developmental psychology is counselors, social workers, parents, those who care for adults. Most nursing it's worth noting that most nursing programs and medical programs require this course as a prereq to get into nursing school and medical programs because what we want people to do is care for people at their developmental stage. One of the most tempting things to do as adults with children is assume they have the same cognitive capacities that we do, and we assume that they should be able to make the right decision. They should be able to solve a problem when they don't actually have those capacities at that moment in their development. Okay. So meeting a child where they are, again, when I first got out of college, I went into social services. And I visited a lot of my counselor and social work colleagues and stuff like that. And I always found it interesting. They all had two books in in their office. They most of them had lots of them, but they had two books that were in most common. One was the DSM, which is a Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which provides your diagnostic code for what you're treating that individual for. It gives you the symptomologies, all that kind of stuff. The second one is their book on human growth and development. And I was always curious, so I asked a few, why do you have that? And they said, well, it to a lot of people it might maybe make conceptual sense, but you don't treat a child with 5-year-old with depression the same way you treat an adult with depression because they're both at a different social, cognitive, and physical development stage. And so you got to remind yourself if you have a 5-year-old client, you need to approach them differently and talk to them differently than if you have a 30-year-old client. That made sense. I mean, it kind of is a no duh moment, but then you realize that, well, they do have to change their focus. And a lot of them went back to their book and kind of said, okay, I have a 5-year-old today. This is where they're at. So, kind of an interesting thing to think about. Yes, they have to change, well, mostly the complexity of the questions, right? So, because children are are expressive in their language, whereas an adult can kind of give a rational explanation. So with children, you do more, tell me the story about what happened, blah, 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 versus an adult where you can say, what do you think the causes of that were, right? So yeah, so you change the way you talk and everything with them based on where they are developmentally. So excellent question. Mhm. And so those are different areas that I would encourage you if you're going into those field. It would be important to retain information. Okay. So I mentioned this on Tuesday. There are really kind of three domains that we look at when we're studying human growth and development. Okay. Of course, we look at biological processes. This is neural development, brain development, and even physical development affects the way we grow and develop. Okay. And in each of the age groups that we will go through, we're going to start with biological development. We're going to talk about where they are in their growth cycle, where they are neurologically, where are they cognitively in the development of their brain. Okay. Um, and then we're going to get into the cognitive processes. This, I don't want to say has to do with the complexity of an individual's thoughts because what is complex for someone living in the United States is simple for someone living in, for example, a place like Germany or France, where they have a different kind of more abstract thinking. Okay. And for a society that has complex thinking, complexity, they necessarily can't go to what would be considered a less developed place and be able to survive there because they don't have the skills or the thought processes to survive there. And we'll talk about this when we get to cognitive development, some differences between, for example, indigenous tribes in Amazon versus people at a cognitive stage here in the United States versus people at a cognitive state of Germany. We'll see that it's not about heightened level of cognition, it's about the level of thought that requires an individual to exist in their environment. Okay. Um, but we'll talk about how, in the area of cognition, we'll talk about some of the complexities of human life, such as our language. How does our language develop? Why do we have complex language? Because that is our main mode of communication. We'll talk about decision making and how it evolves over time. And we'll get into things like moral development. How do we assess a situation to decide whether it is a moral or unmoral situation. Okay. The third area that we'll assess in each of the age groups is socio-emotional processes. This is how we learn to respond to our world. That's the world of emotions, and how we develop bonds between people. Why is it that we are such a social being? Okay. And I will put on this end as an important aspect because when we talk about biological and cognitive processes, we can't exclude socio-emotional processes. And I can give some biological evidence for this. Okay. One is your social world is so important to you that in your brain, when you're not thinking about thinking, it switches what's called the default network on. Okay. So this is a large area of the frontal cortex that if I were giving you math problems and then I said, when I tell you to stop, I want you to stop doing math problems. And then when I say start, continue to do them. Okay. So sometimes I'll say stop and give you 1 second and say start. Sometimes I will say stop and maybe give you 2, 3 minutes. Sometimes I might give you 10 minutes. And what we find is whether it's a fraction of a second or it's 10, 20 minutes, when the experimenter says stop doing math, that area of the brain shuts off and another area automatically turns on. Okay. This same area of brain that I'm talking about is the brain that is associated with relationships, thinking about friends and family, thinking about your own identity and how your identity relates with your social world. In other words, even when we don't want to think about it and we try to stop to think, we're thinking about others. Now, let's do this brain comparison. I'm talking about what is called the frontal cortical area of your brain. And originally, we thought that this area of the brain was largely due to go to cognitive processes. This is why we can build skyscrapers and automobiles and solve engineering problems and all of these different things. And we thought that that is what that area of the brain really was for. But over the last 30 years, what we have found is if we lay your frontal cortical brain out and we pinroll it on a 8.5, a standard piece of paper, 8.5 by 11, I think it is. And we roll your frontal cortex on that, okay? And we put a quarter on top of it. That quarter represents math problems, engineering problems, um, complexity problems. The other area of the piece of paper is the area of the frontal cortex that is dedicated to your social world, to navigating how to interact with other people, how to be with other people. So we are a social being. And the last example of why this is an important area to consider in development goes back to some ferocious Nazi experiments during World War II. What they did with some individuals in some experiments is they put them in an isolation, and I don't want you to think this isolation is necessarily bad. It was a comfortable place. They had all of the comforts of the world. They had all the water they needed, food they needed. They could warm or cool themselves. Everything that you would need to quote unquote biologically sustain yourself. The thing that they withheld from the person is any type of human contact. They could not hear someone, they could not see someone, and they could not smell someone. And a very interesting thing happened is even though they had all the food and water and biological needs met, within 72 hours, the body started to go through hypothermia. It started to go through dehydration, even though the person was completely hydrated. it started to go through the starvation process. And the interesting thing is the cure was another human being walking in the room, and all those physical symptoms started to go away. So when we deny ourselves human connection, we actually start to physically die. And that's the importance of social emotional connection. Okay. We can't emphasize that point enough, I don't think. Now, you'll notice that this graph is in a Venn diagram because, as we just showed in the Nazi example, these overlap with each other. We know through some research that we'll look at on different developmental theories about the importance of scaffolding in education by giving a child peers and adults who can help them develop their language abilities, their problem solving abilities, and it requires social interaction. Okay. The cognitive processes, the development of language, and all those allow us to communicate social and emotionally. And there's a connection between, of course, language abilities and all of those with the biological processes as well. Okay. So these are the domains we'll go through, and we'll try and make connections with each one and how they overlap as we go through the age groups that we'll talk about. Okay. All right. Okay. What I want to get into for just because this is kind of the quick part of the class, and I'm hoping if you took at least my Psych 101, this should be review, but it should be with any of your classes, is I want to give you some samples of theories and different ways individuals have thought about human development. Okay. Um, the purpose of this is that theories play an important role in developmental psychology because they try to provide a framework to understand how these changes occur. Okay, now some of these theories, the first one we'll go through is the reason why it's being presented is because one, it was one of the first developmental theories. And two, there's still some popular cultural notions around it. But three, it also set up the importance of early childhood. And so it's important in that it is considered a biological theory. Okay. Um, and let me kind of just introduce it. It's Sigmund Freud's psychodynamic approach to understanding human behavior. And um, um, uh, Sigmund Freud, just kind of, I think I didn't put a lot in. Okay, we'll kind of go over these real quick. Okay, Sigmund Freud's theory comes from his working with people who have neurotic disorders, people who mental illness, criminally minded. He worked a lot with sexual assault survivors, that should say. And one of the main um, trying to think of the word. One of the main disorders that people went and sought back then is something called hysteria. Hysteria was seen to be largely a female disorder. In fact, the term hysteria comes from the word hista, which means female sexual organs. Okay. So, for example, when if a person gets a hysterectomy, that's a removal of the female sexual organs. And what they believed is when a female at this time became uncontrollable, became emotionally charged, became quote unquote irate, that their womb was wandering around their body creating havoc. And that's what created hysteria. Okay. Now, it should be noted that that's why we say someone is being hysterical or something like that, is that's where this term comes from in more modern ways of using the term. And I should also state that once there was more fair and mental health treatment, we have found that men actually have hysteria slightly more than women. It's about a 52-48 split, almost half and half. So this is not purely a female issue. I just want to clarify that in more modern terms. But back then, because women at that time uh, couldn't go to the doctor on their own. They had to have permission of either their father or husband. You can guess a man who has a wife who has emotional issues is definitely going to say, doctor, fix her. All right. So that's the historical context. But what Freud kind of argued is that these emotions, these feelings that people were having were unconscious. Okay. That the person wasn't really aware of why they were having emotional outbursts. And so he developed a theory of the unconscious. Okay. He wanted it to be very biologically based. So he tried to think of what are two drives or instinct, basic biological drives that every human being has, and he came up with Eros and Thanatos. Okay. But those are broad terms because Eros is the life instinct, Thanatos is the death instinct. So those aren't very biological explanations. So he reduced Eros to sexual drives, and he reduced Thanatos to aggression and violent protective drives. And he believed that everything that drives our behavior are due to these two basic biological drives towards procreation and protection and death. Okay. Now, I should note on here that neo-Freudians discounted Freud's notions of sex. Some talked about inferiority and overcoming our inferiority. I can't say that right. Overcome feeling not competent, not that. That kind of took over the sex drive. For others, it was male-female competition, and so it wasn't always. So that was de-emphasized after Freud, but this is kind of the beginnings of this because this is what's going to give us our first developmental theory. Okay. Just really quickly, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but um, Freud believed we kind of use this iceberg model, okay? And so the id, which in German to English translation, its literal translation is it. But it has a little bit more depth in the German interpretation because it is the place, it is the seat of our two primary primordial drives. Okay. The ego is kind of like the executive officer. The ego has access to the external world and it has access to the unconscious drives. And the ego's purpose is to, well, let me put it to you this way. If we just had an id, we probably would have not existed very long. Because, and this is Sigmund Freud talking, not Dr. Peterson. So please, please give me that moment of saying this is not something that I would attune to. But if Dr. Freud was here saying, he would say, if we just had an id, whenever we walked into a group of people, we'd be trying to have sex with each other and beating up each other at the same time. Because that would satisfy those basic primordial urges of our basic human drive. Okay. And if you could imagine, if we did that, we probably wouldn't have existed very long. Okay. So the id developed the ego. The ego takes social context into place and the internal drives, and it figures out what is the most appropriate way to alleviate the needs, the internal needs and the external needs. How it learns this is in early childhood with the interaction between the child and the caregiver. Okay. And this is where, according to Freud, where most dysfunction can start to arise, is that relationship back then was between the mother and the child, because the ego might make mistakes now. Okay. Now, I will say this again, this is Dr. Freud talking. He took this to an extreme, and I want to just emphasize this extreme he took it to, because he would argue that, and this is him talking again, he would argue that all of you are not here to educate yourself, to become a better person, to get a better job, to get a degree, to self better yourself. No, Freud would argue you're here because it increases the chance that you'll be able to engage in sexual acts later. And that's what he's reduced this down to. So I just want to make that clear, because his developmental theory is going to sound very extreme in its raw version. Okay. So let's talk about that. The first thing that I want you to notice in Freud's theory right now is things happen in age stages. And this is going to be one of Freud's first influences on developmental psychology. Is most theories in developmental psychology are based on stages. And in each of those stages, there is a conflict or something someone needs to experience in order to continue to become a successful human being. Okay. And without those experiences, the person is going to have more difficult trying to achieve those experiences. Okay. In modern psychology, we kind of see this in the notion of language. So language is best developed between 18 weeks of birth to about 6 years old. That's when we can easily learn language. Okay. And this is just an example. That doesn't mean as adults and stuff we can't learn second languages or anything else. But there's some interesting things about this phase, this stage of development in language, is that by about 24 weeks of age, if you have not heard sounds, you won't be able to hear them. Okay, and an example of this is exposure to language. Okay, if you're exposed to just a single language and there are sounds in other languages that are not in your language, after about 24, 6 weeks of development, you no longer have the ability to hear those sounds. Okay. And so an example of this is me and my wife, who my wife was primarily a Spanish speaker growing up, and English is her second language. The only language I heard in little tiny Idaho and Montana was English. Um, and so when we're communicating and she's trying to teach me Spanish, she'll say words and I'll be looking at her and she says, "Well, repeat it back," and I'll only repeat part of it back because there's certain sounds in Spanish that are not in English, and I don't have the ability to hear those. And so this is just an example of how, yes, there are certain periods of life that are sensitive stages where we're best adapt to develop. So that's more kind of the modern kind of take on this. But let's go back to Freud. Um, get him done within 15 minutes, hopefully. So one thing that is kind of interesting about Sigmund Freud's history and is kind of an enigma of him is that he actually, most people think that he developed his developmental theory before his formal theory, but it was actually the other way around. He actually developed his developmental theory after he had completely formulated his theory on drives and the unconscious. And originally, if you look at some of Freud's notes, he didn't want to make his developmental theory sexual, but because that would have conflicted with his formal theory, he was kind of forced to. So I want to kind of give this understanding of this very kind of complex issue that he's talking about. So how does he go about doing this? Well, he looked at things like erogenous zones, and for development, at what stage and age is most satisfying to a human being, and what is most sensual. And in Freudian terms, when I say the word sensual, it's spelled sex. Okay. So he believed that in order for a child to engage in important behaviors, they must be able to get some type of sensual satisfaction out of doing that. Okay. And in his first stage, what is an area of the body that would probably be most important to be gratified? That is probably taking in nutrients from mom's breast or a bottle. Okay. And to kind of explain why this is, um, if you ever want to know the struggles of being a baby, get a bottle, fill it with your favorite juice, and see how labor intensive and how long it takes you to ingest that bottle. Okay. One of the reasons why breast milk and whatnot is so fat heavy is because it needs to be calorie induced in order for the child not to be wasting more calories than it's intaking. And that's why they'd say, that's one of the reasons they say don't give a baby water, for example. There's other reasons, but basically, water in a bottle, the infant is burning more calories than it's taking in. And same with non-fat milks or any of those kinds of things. This is a labor intensive activity. So what Freud believed is that we must get some sensual gratification from this labor intensive activity. Okay. And so he deemed 0 to 2 what he called the oral phase. Okay. And the purpose of each of these stages is to get to overcome and control that need for that type of gratification. Okay. So, for example, an infant who's unable to stop their oral gratification, according to Freud, explains things like substance abuse, obesity, the need to continually consume stimuli and ingest. Freud himself believed that he was orally fixated because from about the age of 12 on, he had to have a cigar every day. In fact, he died of jaw cancer because of that. And so what he believed is an orally fixated person is a person who cannot stop satisfying the need to ingest. Okay. Now, I brought up an example of obesity as an example. So let's fast forward to modern times. One of the biggest myths about obesity that people really believe is a truth is that obese people overconsume food, and if they would stop consuming so much food, they wouldn't be obese. Okay. The problem with that is that's not actually true. The majority of obese people do not ingest any more food than most non-obese people. So it's not about calorie intake. or anything like that or overeating. It's about something else. But if you believe that the reason why someone is overweight is because they eat too much, you're being a psychosexual Freudian, because that just does not fit the facts. Now, just like in any case, there are people who do overeat, just like there are people who don't eat at all, and those are individuals who have some type of disorder. There isn't to deny that, but when we talk about the majority of people, the majority don't eat any more than their underweight counterparts. So, something to think about. And again, I'm just kind of pointing out how Freud has still influenced our attitudes and beliefs about different things. And this is an example of that. Okay. His second phase, and if you were to ask me, usually our first celebrations where we really get excited, like is kindergarten graduation now, right? Getting a driver's license, graduating high school, getting married, sometimes getting divorced, graduating college. Those are the things that we really celebrate. But I really think that the number one celebration we should do in the beginning is when a child potty trains. Okay. I know this sounds simple to adults. I hope most adults, I hope, and it's an everyday task, but I want you to think of the complexity of potty training. Okay. One, it's going to be the first time that we are truly going to give in to the demands of an authority figure of some type. It's the first time where that our parent is going to say, you need to control your biological urges. Here's how to do it. Da 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 da. Okay. The second part of it is it's going to be the first time that we take personal biological control over biological processes. It's going to be the first time that we say we're going to urinate or defecate at this place during this time, but not right now. Okay. So not only are we giving in, it's going to be the first time we give into our social world, it's going to be the first time that we take personal control over biological needs and wants. I think that's a pretty big feat. And so Freud argued about the age of 2 to 4 is is where sensual gratification comes from anal control. Okay. And this is where the modern term "you're being anal" comes from, is this notion because a person, according to Freud, who becomes anally fixated because they can't control that biological function, they can't control their internal needs, become excessively controlling of their external world. So if you think about a person who is anal, they're the person who is always kind of perfectly dressed, has to have everything in a certain order. Maybe you go to their closet and they have the colored shirts on one side and they have it all perfect and the shoes are all laid out perfect. And if you really want to bug them, you take one of the shoes and put it out of place and watch them panic. Okay, this is someone who is what Freud would term as anally fixated. Okay, and this is usually what we say when we say, oh, that person is being anal, or that in a lot of terms that person has a stick up there. You can finish the rest. Okay, so that's kind of where again the term that person is being anal comes from. But I think the emphasis of this point is that this is really a point in a person's life where they're going to start to control certain aspects of who they are biologically and socially. Okay. So it is a large feat. Okay. All right. All right. Well, let's get through this most controversial part of Freud's theory. And I would encourage in Zoomland, if you have kids around or something like that, that you put headphones on or you're at work and have colleagues around, because this one gets a little bit sticky. What Freud believed between the age of 4 and 6 is he termed it what's known as the phallic phase. The reason why he called this the phallic phase is this is during the period where most parents will walk in on their child and the child will be touching one of their private parts. Okay. Completely natural, completely understandable. Okay. Now, I will tell you, Freud did get this wrong. We actually, with modern ultrasounds and imaging techniques, human beings start touching themselves even before we're born. Okay. Why? Because there's certain zones in our body that have bundles and bundles of nerves that when you touch it, it feels good. Okay. So it's a completely natural process. And so here's where I'm going to give you some parenting advice on this issue. If you walk in on your child, don't freak out, don't slap them, don't do anything, but instead ask them a simple question. Why are you doing that? Okay. And here's why I would encourage you to ask it in that calm way. If the child says, it feels good, mommy or daddy or whoever, then they're doing it for natural reasons. Okay. If instead they say something like, oh, Uncle Joe showed me how, or oh, I watched it, or oh, I saw da 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 do it, then you know you have a problem. Okay. Those are the biggest red flags that you could ever get. Okay. But the issue is, and when I worked with children who were sexually abused, the biggest mistake parents always made is when they walked in on their child and caught them doing that, they freaked out. They got mad at the child. So is the child really going to tell you the truth of why they're doing that? No. Okay. So a little bit of parenting there to kind of do that. It's a natural thing. If it's done because it feels good, it's natural. If it's done because of some external source, then you really should, you have problems. And so does your child, and you should help them out. Okay. But what Freud also was trying to get at this phase is one of the when we get to well, actually even starting at the age of 3, one of the most important things we could do for our children between the age of 3 and 6 is let them play. There is clear research that shows the more a child plays between the age of 3, the better they are academically, the better they are socially, and the better they are health-wise. Play during this age group is being shown to be the number one thing that we as parents and communities can let a child engage in. Okay. But what type of play is a kiddo usually doing? They're doing what's called the imaginative role play. Okay. So they watch Superman on TV and then they have the towel around their neck and they're jumping off couches. They watch the firefighters, so they go play firefighters. They watch doctors, so they go play doctor. They watch mom and dad, so they go play house. What they're doing is they're learning what things work for them and what doesn't work for them. What they like about something else, like I can't fly, but I can be a helpful person like Superman was. Yeah, I don't have the superpowers, but that doesn't mean I can't still help. I don't like firefighting. I don't like heat or something like that. And they're learning what skills and everything are necessary to get through life. And in fact, the major parts of our personality and our identity are developed before the age of 5. Okay. The major determinants of who we are were set long ago during those times we were playing as children. Okay. Now, what is Freud getting at during this period? Okay. is he comes up with two complexes. And one is the Oedipus complex for boys, and what is known as the Electra complex for girls. Okay. Because he had to put these in sexual terms, Oedipus is a Greek tell about a legend that this young man named Oedipus would grow up and kill his father and have sexual relationships with his mother. Okay. As the legend goes, because the biological parents were so scared of this, they sent little Oedipus as a baby to another town to basically adoptive parents. He never knew they were adoptive parents and he grew up with them. And then he heard about this legend that what he was supposed to do. Because he thought they were his parents, he decided to leave so he didn't kill his what he thought was his biological dad and relationships with mother. He moved back to the town and he fell in love with his biological mother and killed his biological father. That's kind of the tale behind Oedipus, which I kind of doesn't make sense. It sounds like Oedipus did everything he could not to go through what he went through, but he did anyways. But that is the basic idea is what the young boy is doing is he's looking at the first love in his life. And I don't mean that in a erotic term or anything else. Freud does, but the first person who you have emotional connection with, which is usually the mother. And what the boy wants is the mother's affection. Okay. But who gets mom's affection? Dad. So, what do I need to do in order to get mom's affection? Is I need to be like dad. I need to model myself like dad. And then eventually I'll take over dad's role. Okay. Um, oh, sorry. Sorry about that. Um, the on the female end and on the Electra end, it's about a girl's recognizing because mom is still the first love. Hello? Hey, I'm teaching. Okay, call me in 15. Call me in 15. Okay. Okay, bye. Okay, sorry. Okay. Anyways, back to class. Um, uh, because mom is still the object of love even for young girls, Freud came up with this thing called penis envy, where a young girl looks at dad and sees that dad has something that she doesn't. And because she sees how powerful dad is and everything else, she wants that too. But who has access to dad's thing? Mom. So what does the young girl do? She goes and she takes on the role of mom, takes on the behaviors of mom, learns how to be a mom in hopes that she will, again, in Freudian terms, replace mom for dad's thingy. Okay. Put it in more childish terms. Okay. Um, so, uh, so this is kind of an interesting part of Freud. But I do want to emphasize and take kind of maybe the sexual part out of it, okay? And maybe get to what Freud would have said if he didn't have to add this into his theory. Is I mentioned that during this period of time is when children are modeling behaviors. And one behavior they model is parents' behaviors and people who are like them, the same, that they feel is the same gender. So a young boy will most likely model dad. A young girl will most likely model mom. Okay. And so we have had enough decades where we've had children who have been raised by single parents. Okay. Now, I don't want you to make a blanket statement about single parents. Okay. Single parents do amazing work. They raise amazing children. They and they have all my gratitude and everything. There is, though, some, and it's very few, single parents who had such a difficult time with the opposite sex that they withhold their child from having relationships with him. So, for example, a young mom with a young boy who doesn't expose the young boy to healthy male role models, such as a boyfriend or grandpa or uncles, whatever, or a dad who has a young girl who doesn't expose the young girl to healthy same-sex role models like girlfriends, um, aunt, aunts, grandmothers, those kinds of things, those healthy, where they could learn, and they try to hold them back from them. What we find is that these children grow up and they have hard time staying in relationships. They have a hard time communicating. They have difficult time interacting with the opposite sex. Okay. And this is even true with children who are gay or lesbian. This is true of children who grow up to be non-binary, as you would say. We're finding that regardless of your sexuality or your gender identity, that this type of exposure is important. Being exposed to both sexes or any sex in between is important. Okay. And so I think this is what Freud was trying to get at more in less terms than what he put it in, is that it's important that children are exposed to healthy role models of both genders and any gender in between. Okay. So that is what I think was meant by that term. The so in the next term, which he termed the latent term, this is between 6 and puberty. He really didn't believe much development happened. We kind of developed the skills of life, writing, reading, arithmetic, but we really don't really do anything. And this, as you will see as we go through this class, had an unfortunate impact on the study of human development because the children who largely are ignored in the research literature are elementary school children. Most of what we know about this age group doesn't come from experiments within the family or anything else. It comes from experiments that are done in elementary school with school teachers. So that's still an unfortunate part. And if you want to go into studying child development, this is still a neglected age group that we don't really know a lot about. And then the latent period, the genital period is when we go through physical puberty, when we start taking on our secondary sexual characteristics, and we start to uh, have erotic feelings that involve other people. And that is kind of the last phase is a person who gets fixated in the genital phase ends up being the rapists, the people who take advantage of other people, those who cannot control that adult urge become people who aggress towards relationships, including the development, what Freud believed was a development of anti-personality disorder and psychopathology. So, but we'll get to those at another time. It's a little bit more complex than that. So this is the first theory that we needed to discuss. And again, I hope you kind of see some of the trends that are left from that. The issue with Sigmund Freud's theory, I will tell you up front, is that his theory is not testable. We can use the analogies like the analogies I used with that genital phase and whatnot, but he did set up some important aspects about stages, about unconscious drives, and about different phases of life that we go through that determine how we run through the rest of our lives that we'll see throughout. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to